Welcome everyone. We'll wait just a minute more to allow our organizers to let people in the room, and then we'll start. Okay, let's get started. Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on advancing gender equality, women, land, and the SDGs. Land is arguably the world's most important asset, and it's overwhelmingly controlled by men, to the detriment of women, children, and the world as a whole. Today, we're going to discuss how gender equality and other sustainable development goals can be advanced by making rights to land and property more secure for all, and particularly for women. I'm Tim Hanstad, and I'll be your moderator for the session. I serve as a CEO at the Chandler Foundation, which is the philanthropy of Richard Chandler, a New Zealand-born, Singapore-based investor, businessman, and philanthropist who is focused on systems change. At the Chandler Foundation, we advocate for systems change, invest in organizations that are partnering with government to improve the enabling conditions for prosperity. I previously spent more than 3 decades as a social entrepreneur and NGO leader, including working on issues of land rights. We have a terrific panel for you today, and I will introduce them shortly, but first a bit about how this is going to go. Our session will run about 1 hour and 20 minutes, and at a high level, it will include audience polls to gather some quick insights from you, our audience, 2 rounds of questions from me for our panelists, questions from you, the audience, and we'll close with the final word of advice from each panelist. By the close of the session, I'm confident we will have learned more, broadened our perspectives, and hopefully leave inspired to take action. So let me start by introducing our terrific panel. First, Faith Alubbe. Faith is the CEO of the Kenya Land Alliance, which is an organization dedicated to advocating for land laws and policies that ensure secure and equitable access to land and natural resources. Faith, who is a lawyer, has been working with women and communities on land rights and governance for almost a decade. Faith has worked at the community level, at the national level in Kenya, and at an international level, leading continent-wide communities that are focused on this important issue. Next, we have Laura Burks. Laura is Deputy Director for Strategy, Planning, and Management at the Gates Foundation, where she oversees the Agriculture Development Team's strategy and operations functions, and manages cross-cutting portfolios like women's empowerment, nutritious food systems, and monitoring and evaluation. Laura previously worked at USAID, managing global nutrition programs and developing the nutrition strategy under the President's Feed the Future initiative. And during her time at USAID, she lived and worked in Tanzania. Next, Anne Veneman. Anne, like Faith, is also a lawyer. Anne served as the United States Secretary of Agriculture, and if that job wasn't big enough, also went from there to serve as the Executive Director of UNICEF. Anne currently serves on the board of directors at Nestle, as well as on numerous nonprofit boards. Anne has been on the Forbes World's 100 Most Powerful Women list, and we are so grateful, Anne, that you've joined us today. And finally, we have Deanna Fletschner. Deanna is a senior gender expert and director of research at Landesa. Deanna leads Landesa's global research, evaluation, and learning efforts. She's a PhD, a development economist, former faculty member at the University of Washington, and has more than 20 years of experience teaching, conducting research, designing programs, monitoring and evaluating interventions with a special focus on rural women. Deanna's done work with NGOs in 14 different countries. Okay, before I get to our panel, allow me to frame our topic today using 5 numbers. The first number, 3/4. Land and property can form up to 3/4 of a nation's wealth. And land and property frequently comprise 3/4 of a household's wealth. So given the importance of land in terms of overall wealth and of both a nation and of individuals, you might think that rights to land would be clearly and carefully documented across the world. Well, you would be wrong. Second number, 30%. Despite the importance of land, the World Bank estimates that only 30% of the global population has legally registered rights to their land and homes. And if you guess that poor and marginalized groups are much more likely to be missing from that 30%, you would be correct, particularly women. Third number, 12%. A study across 10 countries in Africa found that only 12% of women reported owning land individually, compared to 31% of men. And countries outside Africa reveal similar patterns in the percentage of women who report owning land. Most of the world's land is controlled by men or man-made and male-led institutions. And this has clearly resulted in economic, social, and political exclusion, or at least limitation of women. Fourth number, 3.8. Studies indicate that women with strong land and inheritance rights earn more income. A study from Tanzania found that such women earn up to 3.8 times more income. And an increased income is just one of many benefits that studies from various settings link to stronger land rights for women. And finally, the fifth number, which is not a number at all, but a question mark. And this question mark represents the data we don't have about land rights, and particularly about women's land rights. Most of the data that does exist on land rights is not gender disaggregated. And although we know enough about women's land rights to know it is a substantial problem, we don't know enough to know how best and where best to address it. It's hard to manage a problem you've not measured. Measuring the extent of poverty or access to financial services was an important early step in the world's efforts to combat those problems. But we are severely lacking in the first step, that is measuring the problem when it comes to women's land rights. Numbers, data, are necessary to understand a problem, but it often requires stories to bring them to life. And when I think about women's land rights, I am reminded of the many of the literally thousands of women in the field who have generously shared their stories with me over the years. Stories of exclusion, of insecurity, of lacking independence, opportunity, and even hope, because land rights systems were lacking and indeed stacked against them. 5 years ago, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted with specific commitments from governments about making progress on land rights, including women's land rights. And these commitments on progress also require commitments to collect the necessary data to see and measure that progress. But today, few governments appear to be making progress on those commitments. So our diverse panel of experts and leaders today will share insights about this broader topic, the connection between gender equality and land rights, the connection to the SDGs, the challenges to making progress, and the opportunities for making progress. But before we engage our panel, we'd like to know something about you, our audience. We have a multiple choice question here we'd like for you to answer, aimed at understanding who is in attendance today. So you're going to see a question come up, please mark the answer that best describes your institutional affiliation. Give you a few seconds to answer and submit, and then we'll look at the responses together. Okay, can we see the responses, please? Great. It looks like we have about half of the audience from NGOs, of which a little over half are working on land rights, and then a mix of people from academia, donors, and other. Great. Thank you. Okay, let's jump to the panel. Deanna, I want to start with you. And I want to start with some context setting. So first, for purposes of the audience, what is a simple definition or way of thinking about land rights? Can we simply say that people either own land or they don't own land? How should we think about or define land rights?
Yes, and can I ask to have a slide to help me make this a bit more easy to follow? Essentially, yes, a lot of people think about ownership of land, but the reality is that the concept is a bit more nuanced. And I think it would be helpful to step back and think of why are we thinking of women's land rights? And in this context, it's important to consider that it's a foundation to a number of development outcomes. In particular, in the context of the SDGs, a foundation to eradicating poverty, hunger, and gender equality, or getting to gender equality. For that to happen, it's important to consider two types of things. One is what rights women have. And here you can think of a bundle of rights. Women need to, of course, be able to use a piece of land, but they also need to be able to make decisions on how that plot of land is going to be used. And they also ideally would be able to transfer some of those rights so that they can obtain a loan if they offer the land for collateral, or they can rent the property, or they can sell it or purchase it, and so forth. It's not enough to have those rights. Women also need to be able to exercise those rights, which is not the same thing in many parts of the world. And importantly, they need to be able to count on those rights. They need to make sure that they think they're going to continue having these rights so that they can have a long time horizon for their decisions or their planning. And I know this sounds complicated, and I don't mean to get stuck in that complexity. So perhaps two helpful measures on how we think about women's land rights and we can track progress, in fact, are the ones embedded in the SDGs, are do women have documents that they can use to prove that they have rights to a particular piece of land? And do women perceive themselves as secure? Do they feel like they will retain those rights for a certain period of time, say 5 years, so that they can think a bit long-term and not be just going from one day to the next? I hope that provides a bit more context for the explanations you're going to hear in the rest of the hour.
Yeah, thank you. And that's helpful. It's not just about owning or not owning. Those issues about do they have a document? Are they feeling secure in their rights in terms of questions for them? Now, just a follow-up question to that. You lead Landesa's research, evaluation, and learning, and you know something about the literature out there on women's land rights. Can you briefly describe what does that existing research and literature tell us about the role of land rights in benefiting women?
Yeah, the two dimensions that I was talking about, which rights women have and whether they can count on those rights, have been found to relate very directly to the extent to which women can involve in their household decisions. This is the way they actually get to influence what happens in the world and how we get to all the other development outcomes that we're talking about. And when I say they get to influence household decisions, we're talking about whether or not they have a say into what the household does, how it uses its resources to produce, whether or not they have a say into how the proceeds that the household obtains are used, on what they're used, and importantly, who gets to benefit from that. And so this is production, it's consumption and investment, and it's investment on whom within the family. And what we find on the production side is that if women have secure land rights, they're able to influence economic decisions. And so we see more trees being planted, we see more soil conservation practices. We also see women being able to access loans in the case of a study in Rwanda, for example. And we also see increases in off-farm income because they know they have a fallback position. These are studies from Rwanda, from Benin, from Tanzania, for example. If women have influence on what the household produces, they also have a say on how those resources are being used by the household. And we do see improvements in a number of socially desired outcomes. So we see that children are less likely to being sick. We see that children's educational attainments are more likely to go up. We see improvements when it comes to food. So a larger percentage of the family's budget dedicated to food expenditures. We see increases in food security, and we see a decrease in children's malnutrition. So all in all, what we're seeing here is a significant improvement in human capital investments. So investments in the next generation, that it's why both the SDGs and other efforts are making the case for women's land rights being foundational to both women's empowerment and gender equality, of course, but also to eradicating poverty, to ensuring food security, and a host of other outcomes.
Thanks, Diana. Helpful to get that overview of the literature and the connections between women's land rights and a number of important development goals. I'll come back to you later, but I want to move to Laura. Laura, you have the leadership role on the Gates Foundation's agricultural development team, which is doing great work to increase agricultural productivity and income for smallholders. What is the role of women's economic empowerment in achieving these goals? And how do you at the Gates Foundation think about women's land rights as it relates to these efforts?
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, just a few remarks here. And first off, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this really important panel. There are a number of reasons I'm excited to participate, which I'll touch on at the end. So for our agriculture team, women's economic empowerment actually underpins all of our goals. We view it both as an end goal in and of itself, as well as an enabler for other goals, which for us are around increasing productivity, increasing small-scale producer income, and increasing equitable consumption of safe, affordable, nutritious diets, and of course, increasing women's empowerment in agriculture. We also see, given the rates of women's labor force participation in agriculture across Africa and South Asia where we work, we also see individual women's economic empowerment as a driver of overall inclusive country-led agricultural transformation. So at the foundation, when we talk about women's economic empowerment, we're talking about the transformative process by which women and girls go from having limited power, voice, and choice at home and in the economy to having the skills, the resources, and the opportunities needed to access and compete equitably in markets with the agency to control and benefit from economic gains. So this session is all about data. So that's kind of a lot in terms of a definition of women's economic empowerment. Breaking it down, we're actually really looking at three specific outcomes. One is women's access to income and assets. Two is control of and benefit from economic gains. and 3 is power to make decisions. And for those of you who've worked in land rights for some time, I don't need to tell you that women's land rights and whether or not women have tenure security overall is a core component of all 3 of those outcomes. And Diana has actually already gone into the evidence, so I don't need to repeat here. Obviously, land is one of several agricultural assets we're interested in, but land rights as a whole can influence broader labor markets for women. They can increase returns on their labor. They can give them greater control over those productive assets and potentially enable increased agency over life choices. Plus some of the really strong evidence on the spillover effects and things like soil conservation that Diana has already spoken to. We also see and think about women's land rights as a barometer on how equitable society is overall. So we kind of have dashboards, if you will, that sort of look at countries that we work in, and women's land ownership is one of several metrics that we look at when we're looking at the status of women's empowerment at a country level, of course, where we have the data, which is why we're all here today. And then maybe I'll just conclude on this question by saying, you know, one of the reasons I'm really happy to participate today is because while there's still a ways to go, I actually think there's been tremendous progress in filling both the data and evidence gaps over the last decade in particular, and that's been led by groups like Landesa and the Kenya Land Alliance and others who are on the line. I'm really encouraged because working in women's empowerment in agriculture can feel very complex, very nuanced, very complicated at times, and it's hard to always feel like you're making progress because it's also such a long-term thing. And it feels like what we're seeing coming out of the work on women's land rights in the past couple of years gives me a lot of hope, because I feel like we're getting a lot smarter about measurement. We're getting a lot smarter about ultimately being able to give the right guidance and technical assistance to country governments who are going to play a major role in establishing and consistently maintaining equitable land tenure security over time for women. So really encouraged to be here and acknowledge some of the gaps that we need to close, but also recognize all of the good work that has gotten us to where we are today.
Thanks, Laura. And we maybe just skipped over it, but I just want to ask a quick follow-up question about, you know, agricultural farming sometimes thought of as man's work. Respond to that.
Depends on who you ask. So no, the data would indicate that it is certainly not men's work. In sub-Saharan Africa, 40 to 60%, depending on which country you're in, of the labor force is actually women. You see gender disaggregated data can talk about different breakdowns in who is farming which crops, which ones are most profitable, who's having access to market. So I think very clearly the data would strongly advocate for it not being man's work. And in fact, if you look at trends over time, you look at some of what we're anticipating for COVID impacts, it will increasingly be women's work. And I think the important thing to note is it's women's work. Let's make sure that they actually are able to capture the income from that work, as opposed to it being the income that then goes into the man's hands.
Thank you, well said. By the way, I failed to mention at the beginning to our audience that if you have questions for the panelists, please submit them through the chat function. I think we don't have a Q&A function, but there's a chat function. And feel free to direct it to a specific panelist or not. And we will field those questions closer to the end. Moving to Anne. Anne, you've led the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is a huge $100 billion+ agency with more than 100,000 employees. And it has a really broad mandate that covers not only agriculture, but forestry, rural development, food programs. You also led the UNICEF, which is another large, $3 billion a year, I think, UN agency with more than 10,000 staff helping children around the world to survive and thrive. So in those different roles with these large agencies, you have these incredible leadership roles. How did concerns around land rights affect outcomes these agencies care about?
Need to unmute. Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me today. You know, USDA obviously does a lot of data. It has statistics on land ownership. It does the ag census. But when I really became aware of the issue of land rights and land tenure was when we were having issues in the department with particularly small and minority farmers who were having difficulty accessing USDA programs. So the question was, were they being discriminated against and so forth? And as we began to really look at what was the problem, the issue that kept coming back up was not having adequate title to land. So particularly as land had been passed down from generation to generation, particularly in some of these small and minority farmers, it had not been recorded properly. And so people didn't have access to the programs like loans through USDA or insurance through USDA. So I began to be aware of the land rights and land tenure issue. When I went to UNICEF, it was the height of the AIDS pandemic. And my first trip and several of my earliest trips were really looking at the impact of AIDS and so forth. And I remember at that time encountering women who had lost husbands, children who had lost both parents, but particularly I would hear these stories of, you know, when the husband dies, the father of the children dies, suddenly the land that they were living on is taken away from the family and given back to the father's family, which only increases the poverty and the impact on children, as was just being talked about, on their education, on their health, on their nutrition. And so as I traveled around, I really looked for different examples. Obviously in Africa, it varies so much among and between countries. The rules are so different. There's so many areas where land is still owned by the community or the tribe, or, you know, the traditional methods of land ownership. So it's very difficult to really get to the bottom of this, but we know that without some kind of structure around land ownership, it's very difficult for women to own land, for women to inherit land. It does increase poverty, particularly when the family is, you know, loses a family member. And so I do think that land rights is extremely important. It's why during my time at UNICEF and after, I've been so interested in the work of Landesa and other organizations that are really pursuing this very important issue.
Thank you, Anne. It's really interesting what you point to in terms of the situation in the United States, because we sometimes think of these issues as issues for low and middle income countries, but in fact, of course, they are not at all. And then, of course, the issue of women being disinherited and thrown off land is just so common and common around the world. And it's just one of many reasons why making sure that women have secure rights to land, even when the family itself holds that land securely. Faith, you know, as Anne just kind of alluded to, land rights can be a complex institutional issue, and always with important historical, geographical, and cultural underpinnings, which means it varies from setting to setting. But from your work in Kenya and with your continent-wide networks, can you provide some examples of how women are constrained, limited, or excluded when they lack rights to land?
Thank you very much, team, and to the organizers. Thank you for including me into this very important conversation. Digging right into it, when women are excluded from owning land, there's always that generational exclusion that has been alluded to by all speakers. As we understand, 70% of our land in Africa and in Kenya is held communally. So if it is held communally, there is a likelihood that traditional governance systems are usually come into play, which are they're not very patient with inclusion of women in decision-making spaces. Thus, there's that issue of generational inclusion that is perpetuated when women cannot have a say on the land that they live on. There's the issue of credit that Diana alluded to. Land is one of the most surest collaterals that we have in Kenya and Africa. If women cannot own land, and if they have limited bundle of rights, like a woman most probably will be expected to use and access land, but not own and control. So there's that limited decision making that she cannot use her piece of land to get any form of loan in order to use that money for any other use, like educating her children, securing her food security. It was alluded to by Diana and Laura. So when women are denied women land rights, there's also that possibility of being affected by very high literacy issues. Like you get like in the rural setting, very few women can actually read policies and be able to use the policies as tools to access any form of justice. Thus, it means that even if they have an issue, a legal issue, they depend on someone else to basically interpret such documents for them. So it means that the generational nature of it, if my mother, for instance, was educated to a certain level and she did not have it easy, then she'd try and find whatever she can use, which generally is land, because it's our main source of economic empowerment. It's our main source of identity. So you get that a woman would use land and land-based resources to further her family well-being, to try and educate her daughters, because there's always that aspect that the girl child might not give more benefits as the boy child. It's still there are connotations of it. So I'd say when a woman is denied her right to land, there's compromised livelihoods. It's been alluded to. A compromised livelihoods, it's to the detriment of her family, her household. There's compromised access to food security. When she cannot participate in decision making, it means she just becomes a recipient and like a secondary or subservient, subjugated by a system that is not favoring her.
Thanks, Faith. Yeah, it seems so important. I guess as you point out, land is not just related to livelihoods. Land is access, and rights to land have to do with power and voice within the household and within the broader community, and also with identity. That identity and the associated dignity, which are so important as well. We have another audience poll question, so another opportunity here to get input from our audience. So if we could please put up this next question. And this is a question about, it's a multiple choice answers. In thinking about land rights, how important do you think land rights is to women's economic empowerment? And the way to think about this is compared to other levers. So there we have it. So how important do you think land rights is to women's economic empowerment? Extremely, very, somewhat, not important. I'll give you about 20 seconds to answer and submit, and then we'll look at the answers together. Thank you. I think that's enough time. If we could please see the answers. Well, and of course there's no necessarily right answer here, but vast majority are saying extremely important. Interesting. Okay. This may also be likely informed by the audience, which is not completely random, as Deanna and others would be quick to remind me. Let's move to another round of questions for the panelists. And Deanna, I want to turn to the SDGs and their potential as a game changer for women's land rights. You were part, I know, of a Landesa team that was active along with several other organizations, starting I think in 2013, in successfully advocating for land rights and women's land rights to be implemented into the SDG targets and indicators. So that was a win, but despite those targets and indicators, getting the data collected to measure and track the progress has been a struggle. Where are we today on this topic, and what needs to happen to make progress?
Yes, the inclusion of land rights and women's land rights in the SDGs was certainly a tremendous win. The SDGs are an extremely powerful platform, no question about that. I would say even the process of getting us there was helpful because as what we have all been discussing already shows, this is a relatively complex issue for which there was no concrete agreement on how to do things. So the period pre-approval of the SDGs brought together a number of organizations. That was already a very big step. A lot of these happen under the Global Land Indicators Initiative, but as people will recognize, there was support from very, very important and large organizations here from multiple sectors. So that was already a win. If we look back a few years ago, today we are more or less in agreement on what we're trying to measure. So that was great. The second piece that was great was that governments now have a mandate. They've agreed to improve women's land rights, in fact, to ensure that all women have secure rights to land. And they agreed to a measure to track that. So perfect, that is fantastic. And this also has given high visibility to the issue because of the prominence of the SDGs. Now, that was 2015, 2016. We're 5 years later now, and it's important to step back and think, okay, what did we get? And given that we really care about changes for women land rights, what has happened? And there have been changes in the past few years, so there are reasons to celebrate. And I'll just give some examples because this is one way in which the SDGs can be helpful. They can highlight what good progress has been made. Examples include countries like Ecuador and Honduras who have been formalizing land and including women in those programs. Examples include Bangladesh with their project that has been targeting 40,000 villages and reach more, something in the order of 700,000 women. Examples include Tanzania and the multi-stakeholder platform organized under the gender ministry to come up with a strategy on how to improve women's land rights as a collaborative effort of government agencies and civil society organizations. And examples include the Land Rights Act in Liberia that was passed 2 years ago, and that can help harmonize rights that are customary with statutory rights and protect the poor and so forth. So there have been movements and in the right direction. The same can be said about the data part. As Laura and others will tell you, there have been efforts to come up with the right instruments to try to gather data, efforts to try to work with the statistical agencies to start collecting that, and some efforts to start looking at how to use the data. That's within the formal part of the process. And there's parallel efforts like Mdgs, a global poll trying to come up with a rapid and quick polls on how we're doing on tenure security. But very important in all this is that these are really promising efforts. This is still only just a few steps in the right direction. Both these efforts and everybody else, we have a long ways to go before we can really get to the commitment of ensuring that all women have secure rights to land. And one of the things that several of us under the Land and SDG Momentum Group are doing is saying, if we're really going to leverage the SDGs, we have to make sure that land rights keep being a highly visible issue. Within the SDGs, governments have made too many commitments, so it's very easy to forget about the challenging ones. And now that we have the challenges associated with COVID-19, governments are even more worried about a number of other competing issues. So we have to make sure that land rights and women's land rights remains key in the agenda. And what we're doing is working on two fronts. One is helping countries, government, civil society, all stakeholders to report. The more people talk about what they're doing or what's not being done, the more we're going to be able to make progress. These will help the governments have incentives to show what they're doing, and this will allow civil society to have levers to advocate for further change. And if we make sure that we have enough prominences within the SDGs, then the other piece is making sure that those who want to act have good data to do it. And right now we are somewhere in not having enough data, not having the right data, and particularly not using that data. And so it's about changing the culture so that we address these challenges using evidence, using data, and we all can play a role in this process.
Great, thanks. And it is interesting to hear that we all indeed can play a role, and about the connection between data and advocacy, and the fact that it's not just governments that, of course, we want governments to be collecting data, but there are roles for others as well. I mean, you mentioned Mdgs, which is, I think is, for those of you who are in the audience who don't know about Mdgs, take a look at it. It's an interesting process and effort to gather data from a private setting. And speaking of SDGs and advocacy, as head of UNICEF, you were champion of the Millennium Development Goals, which is the groundbreaking precursor to the SDGs. And I know you were active in using the Mdgs as a framework for forward progress. So based on that experience, you know, as a longtime senior level insider, both the UN and within government, two questions for you. One is, how do you view the SDGs as a useful framework for UN agencies and for governments, and maybe more specifically relevant to many in our audience, and so many are within NGOs, and I know some that are doing advocacy. What advice would you have for outside advocates in pushing the UN or pushing member governments on issues such as this one? What's effective and what's not?
Well, I think, well, first of all, let me address the MDGs. We were very active in UNICEF in promoting the MDGs. We like to say that they really were centered around children, whether it was education or child health, child mortality and maternal mortality, nutrition issues, the importance of the first 1,000 days. I mean, and then getting to poverty and so forth. All of those were really very child-centric. But the one thing that we really started to focus on when I was there was the importance of data. And it goes back to what we were just talking about, is that UNICEF collects a lot of the data around child and maternal mortality and nutrition and access to clean water and so forth. But one of the things we realized is it wasn't effectively being used. So we started to, you know, actually break down the data by country, and then our representatives began to really use that country data to work with their government counterparts to really look at where are the gaps, where are the areas where the you know, the lack of access to nutrition or the lack of access to immunizations for better child health. Where are those gaps so that you could better target resources and address the issues to better achieve the MDGs? And I think it's important to point out that tremendous progress was made in achieving the MDGs. Were they completely met? No. But the SDGs now really build upon what the MDGs were and what they started. I was long gone after when the SDGs were being developed. I think there's a few too many of them because we sometimes get lost in how many things there are. But we do have them. They're very useful for helping helping to create progress in the right direction. I think they give us a directional roadmap. I think in working with the UN on these, I think it's very important, and I always encouraged, you know, the people that I worked with in the UN, we must work together with NGOs, with governments, with the United Nations. We have common interests. We are not competitors. We need to be collaborators. And so as we see all these issues around the MDGs, I think it's important to look at collaborative ways to advance the various objectives of the MDGs and work together. I mean, that would certainly be my recommendation. And really also when it comes to land rights, it seems to me that we really have to help governments build frameworks for how to address land rights, how to put the right rules together, how to put the right systems together for the registration of land. And how can NGOs, governments, the private sector work together to help that happen in the various countries?
Thank you, so well said. And I know your comments about collaboration and the need for collaboration across NGOs and UN agencies and governments was music to the ears of not only many in the audience, but to one of our organizers, Catalyst 2030, which I should have mentioned at the beginning. Catalyst 2030 is a movement founded by award-winning social entrepreneurs that are looking to accelerate progress on the SDGs through collaboration and through a systems change approach. And so for those of you who are in the audience today, don't know about Catalyst 2030, check out their website. Faith, I was going to ask you if you had the ear of government, what would you say? But I know actually that you often do have the ear of government. You spend time talking to governments and advocating. How do you advocate with them? What do you find is effective? And can you point to constructive steps that governments have taken that should be celebrated and perhaps replicated?
Thank you very much, Tim. As I've mentioned, for us African women, land is very important because it's so basic, even at household level, to a point where the way I relate to my relatives determine the bundle of rights I'll have on our community land. So for us, it's quite important. When we are relating to the government, I like the idea that Anne has brought up about that collaborating and working together. But for us, if you look at the majority of, let me say, Kenyan women, African women, there's that challenge of elite capture of most conversations. Let me say that. There's a level that the usual small-scale woman farmer, which are the majority, they rarely sit on certain tables, decision-making tables. So it becomes a challenge to even start explaining what are SDGs to them and how do they benefit them. So for governments, I'd like to say, let's simplify the discussion first and stop fragmenting the discussion. We cannot have ourselves working in silos and targeting the same target group, which we are not talking to, we are talking at. So as we work together, we should find ways of talking to them, working with them, not working for them, because they know what they want. They might not be in most of the spaces that a lawyer like Faith would be, but they know what they want. They know how to engage the system. They know what would benefit them. They know in their own language, they know how to identify and claim their right to land. I'd also say most of the time you get that there is the issue of multiplicity of laws. One issue is affected by 7, 8 laws, legislations, and you start asking yourself, if I'm a woman at local level, and for instance, I want to access matrimonial property, my husband is deceased, how do I start claiming my right on collectively held lands, and I'm not privy to these certain laws, and I do not even have the ability to pay any legal practitioner to help me access these rights that I'm being denied by a patriarchal system, I'm being denied by lack of inclusion and generational exclusion. So governments should find a way of avoiding that. It's easy to have policy coherence because we should plan and draft with the person that we are thinking about in mind. And I'd give an example. In my country, if you're a woman and you want to access community land, you have to know some level, some pieces of the articles in the Constitution. That is one. You have to know some articles in the Community Land Act 2016. That is 2. You have to know some articles in the Matrimonial Property Act. That is 3. You have to know some articles in the Physical Planning and Use. Those are 4 acts that I've mentioned. And it's because I'm a lawyer. I wonder how many women can be as privileged as I am. So we have to find some level of policy coherence so that women at local level can actually benefit from all these policies that we make in all these spaces that they're not in. There's the element of strategic documents, economic documents that governments develop, like Vision 2030 for my country. There's the Vision 2063 for the AU. If we can find a way of including every type of woman, because women are not homogeneous. If we find a way of including every group of women so that their opinions are included, so that we work together, the aspect and the notion of leave no one behind would really make us own some of these international legislative frameworks, regional frameworks that are always spoken at a very macro level, leaving majority of the women out. Lastly, Tim, I'd talk about resourcing, and I'm glad I've looked at the chat. There's Esther Maura and Eva Combra who are talking about resourcing of women land rights. As we speak, most of our laws are very beautifully written, but they are poorly enforced. So if they're poorly enforced, it means that women were sort of mark timing. They are just laws that are put on shelves somewhere and voluntary guidelines that are put on shelves somewhere, which are not really benefiting us as majority of small scale farmers, as majority of people who better communities for lack of a better expression. But when women are more empowered and on land, as it has been said, then a community becomes better. So when it comes to resourcing of women land rights is very important, because even if you work together, state actors and non-state actors, there has to be a system of resourcing both the duty bearers and the right holders, so that the right holders can be empowered enough, progressively empowered enough. And Diana mentioned it when she spoke about policies and progressive laws that are being put in place all over the country and all over Africa. That might be true, but if the people, the right holders, cannot use these policies as tools to actualize or realize women land rights, hence better livelihoods and better well-being, then they're of no use to them and majority of us. So I'd like to say we have to develop better resourcing mechanisms for both state and non-state actors to realize women land and property rights, and also put in place better monitoring and evaluation systems so that we also evaluate at local level how the laws are helping the women to realize women land rights. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Melinda. So well said. And you know, laws and policies are often necessary, never sufficient. And this gap between laws and policies are often on the books and then actually making rights real on the ground is such an important issue. And on this, I know that there's a campaign out there that the many groups that probably in the audience are working on the Stand for Her Land campaign. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that campaign, take a look at the website. This is a way for you to get involved, or certainly to learn more about the issue. Stand for Her Land campaign. Laura, so as we mentioned earlier, it is a challenge to manage a problem when it's not measured. So I want to turn back to the topic of data, and specifically the data gap when it comes to women's land rights. How important is it to close this? Why? And what steps might be taken by the various stakeholders to help close this gap? What's needed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to me, and probably to many of us, closing the data gap is actually about so much more than just getting a specific number, right? I think with better data, as you've heard from everyone who's just spoken, you know, we can do things like fill evidence gaps about what works best to secure women's land rights, not just now, but over time. We can evaluate some of these land titling programs that are going on and formal registration interventions to help governments roll out more equitable programs. As Faith has mentioned, we could help more women gain access to other services, especially financing, given the important role that women's land rights plays in their potential to access credit and things like that. We could see more women earning higher incomes and as a result investing more in their land, which can then set off a chain reaction of community investment that drives economic growth from agriculture and has been, frankly, one of the best, most evidence-based poverty reducing interventions for decades. If we don't have the underlying data that tells us how that land is demarcated, who owns the land, whether the title is single or jointly owned, what will happen to land rights over time if a family member passes, we just don't have the fundamental building blocks to getting us all of those things we've just talked about. So I guess to your question, Tim, on what can stakeholders do, there's the relatively easy stuff, and I say relatively easy, acknowledging that it's not easy. But frankly, I mean, we see a lot of proposals and Mdgs Foundation, we see a lot of programs. I'm truly, genuinely shocked when I learn that data collected for any development-oriented program nowadays is gender blind. It just is reaching a level that should never be the case. And so one of the most basic things is that we can all insist, no matter what our role is, that any data collected is gender disaggregated. This feels pretty obvious. I know it's not always that easy, but there are plenty of evidence-based methods out there that we should no longer accept, frankly, as a community, data that doesn't have that. I think another piece that would be on the relatively easy side, again, with some challenges, is that there is often a lot of data out there, and this is a big problem within agriculture as a whole, but even if it's collected, it's not shared super efficiently. You're having years-long time lags between when you collect the data and when you actually analyze it. And then it's not always shared in the best way possible that makes it really actionable for policymakers who can actually use that data in real time. And so that would be another thing that I think all stakeholders can really help contribute to, is that efficient and purposeful sharing so that policymakers are equipped with the data that they can best use. think another thing, and a few other panelists mentioned this, you know, from my perspective, good data is cost effective. It's one of the most cost effective things we can invest in. And especially in light of what's happening to national government budgets with COVID, where rightly those budgets are getting tight and are where there is funding available being prioritized for health related issues. It's really imperative that any research and data that's driving that research includes cost effectiveness measures so that we can help governments prioritize the highest impact interventions. Some of the research that we've been seeing coming out of many of the groups that have spoken today, and also the Gender Innovation Lab, is really promising when you look at very small, extremely inexpensive interventions like nudge interventions on top of formalization programs can have a really positive gain for women getting their names on newly formalized titles. So I think that cost effectiveness element is a really big one. So those are all in the sort of relatively easier side of the spectrum. I think the harder things are, you know, in order to achieve the SDGs, I think we have to recognize as a global community that having a land title with a woman's name on it does not equal tenure security. And tenure security implies that there is a whole host of systems that are working and set up equitably regardless of your gender, your income, or your race. Those other systems that are so imperative are the judicial systems, the land rental markets, financial systems, inheritance laws, and more. So at a bare minimum, we can all invest in this gender disaggregated data and getting it more effectively and efficiently. But to truly close the gap, I think we need to look systematically at our work in all of these systems, get better policy coherence, which I think is a huge point that Faith just made. And then make sure that we can say with concrete data and evidence that the systems that support the totality of what make up land tenure security as a whole are fair, equitable, and enforced over time, so that we're not just closing the gap for now for one indicator, but we're closing the gap permanently and sustainably for multiple indicators that give us assurance that we have a land tenure security system that is strengthened and maintained and works equitably for all, not just by the time 2030 rolls around for the SDGs, but also beyond that.
Yeah, you're right, and you've described the measures needed in terms of from the relatively easier to the relatively more difficult. Even the easy ones are challenging, but of course anything worthwhile doing in tackling these big problems is going to be challenging. We've gotten a number of questions from our. Oh, go ahead, Deanna.
Do you mind if I interrupt briefly, just building on all the great examples that
sure.
Laura had mentioned? These are all super important building steps, of course. But I would add, even to that list, I would add two more things that I think are important, that are implicit in what she said, and that are important considering that our audience includes a lot of civil society organizations working on women's rights, and a lot of representatives from academia. When we think of gathering data about women's land rights, it's really important that we hear directly from the women as well. To me, it's still shocking to see that even the good surveys that are out there tend to focus on interviewing the quote unquote head of the household. And if we think of land rights per se, how are we going to trust data when we're asking the most privileged person in the household how the other members of the household feel? When, in particular, when it comes to land rights, women's insecurity often is insecurity that comes from within the household. So one big change that we should try to move towards is towards surveys or other ways of collecting data that really hearing directly from everybody, and this includes from women. So that's one important shift that it's being introduced. I would say this is not just about land rights, and so we can use this opportunity to connect with other people working on women's empowerment more broadly to make sure that we tap into their efforts. So that's one area. And the other area I wanted to bring up is that one of the benefits of the SDGs is that it helps streamline what are we talking about. There's tons of things we can talk about in women's land rights, but we can focus on a few that are the ones highlighted in the SDGs. And if we, and I'm building on what's being mentioned on the chat, if we work with grassroots women and we show them how they can use the information they do have, because they do know whether they're tenure secure or no, they know what the problems are, and they might even have good ideas for how to solve those problems. If we show them how they can package that information in a way that aligns with the SDG commitments, they are going to be able to have, hopefully, a better way to engage in discussions with local authorities and gradually national authorities. And they're also more likely, that their suggestions and their demands are more likely to be seen by a much broader audience. So that's another area where we're collectively can work on and make a difference.
Tim, I wanted just to add on what Diana and Laura had said. I think one of the things we should appreciate is that our land rights, as I had said, community land adjudication and mapping, they're not formalized. We still do not understand where collectively held lands start and end. So in terms of gathering data, usually a huge challenge because we do not really understand where does the ownership of one family start and end. So that always ends up in women not being located in most of the data collection, because you get that communal land rights are not absolute and they have overlapping levels whereby a community owns, then a son inherits, and it's always hard to locate the women. So we should appreciate that from the fact that 70% of our land is communal. Other than that, Kenya Land Alliance attempted to get some data from state actors in regards to resettlement schemes. How many women have their names individually indicated on their certificates of title? And we looked at almost 4.5 titles, certificates of titles, and only 1% had women individually as themselves owning some part of land on the 4.5 million titles that have been issued by the Kenyan government from 2013 to 2017. That is very negligible. So when you're talking about data, I just wanted to express that because of lack of formalization of some of these land rights, there's always that challenge of always locating women in the gathering of data and in understanding how many women own what, how, and how secure is it when you're talking about land tenure. Thank you.
Thanks, Faith. So we have a lot of great questions from our audience, and we have maybe we can take about 10 minutes to touch on some of them. I apologize in advance for not being able to get to all of them. Perhaps we can convince some of the panelists to follow up on them later. There was a question from Li Ping about urbanization and land rights. So much of the context that we've talked about today is maybe more from a rural setting. But are women's land rights equally important in a rapid urbanization setting where women and men perhaps are not relying as much on land for their livelihood? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? Faith?
Yeah, I will attempt. Yes, of course it is. Even if you're looking at urban tenure, you get that the number of women-led households is rising, is increasing. So when you're talking about urban land tenure, like in my country, you get that we also have areas that were adjudicated even during the colonial times to have some informal settlements, and you get that mostly are owned by women. Of course, we've spoken about that women own in terms of access and use. In terms of ownership and control, it's owned mainly by men. So yes, it also affects urban tenure. And mostly in urban tenure, you get that when women can only access and use, they're limited in decision making. They cannot derive any form of investment from such land because decisions are made from elsewhere. Then you get that some of the women that can access and use, even in urban settings, have a challenge in getting credit because they cannot have the certificate of titles, because most of these lands under urban tenure are mainly leaseholds. If it's not leaseholds, then it's a gentleman agreement between a widow, a woman, and someone who has to be male or politically correct. So yes, it happens. It happens even in urban tenure setting.
And I would also say that in thinking about whether we depend on land for a living, we tend to have this picture of land and a farm, but it's really housing as well. We need to have a place where we know that we and our families can have a safe place to be, and businesses. And so depending on what people are involved, I would argue all of us need land for a living in one way or another.
Great. Another question coming from Christine Pearson, who's joining us today from South Africa. To what extent does corruption play in barriers to land rights for women, and what are there technologies or interventions that are promising to help improve data and outcomes for women? Hey. Again, you want to answer the question.
Most of our lands are not digitized, so we do not have a centralized system of knowing who owns what. And with ambiguity and lack of clarity, corruption is breeded very well, because now you cannot monitor and you cannot know who is doing what where, because most of our land records are manual. They are easily manipulated. They are easily transferable. If a widow does not have enough knowledge, if a woman does not have enough knowledge about land rights and land processes, the possibility of her losing a land because of amended records is very high. So corruption plays a huge role in terms of access and in terms of land tenure security.
I can maybe come in on the technology side of that question too. I mean, as there are a lot of technologies out there, GPS enabled technologies that are helping with the demarcation process. I don't want to name a single one because I think there's kind of a suite, but I know various funders have looked at, and programs in Ghana and Rwanda have used GPS enabled tools. I think, and this is, I do recognize that I work for the Gates Foundation, which has a reputation of loving our technologies. But I'll just share, we had an interesting session with some of our leadership a few years ago where we actually did a review of all of the different technologies out there and found that, frankly, that's not the biggest barrier. And in terms of improving outcomes for women, while there are technologies that could help with the demarcation, as Faith said, a lot of that is currently manual records. There's folks using blockchain in different countries to try and improve some of that. So it's promising, but I wouldn't suggest that there is a single technology or even a suite of technologies that is going to substantially improve outcomes for women unless you're actually looking at the system again as a whole, and sort of trying to tackle it more holistically.
And again, perhaps we can, building on these two examples, rely back on it's can be helpful to have clear expectations on what changes we're hoping to see and what we should not be seeing. Language that is easier for everybody to follow so that we're clear on what we're talking about. And then being able to connect the voices from the ground. I mean, they can monitor what's going on very easily and tell us what's happening. If we're able to have a way to channel those voices and to make sure that they're understood because the language is a common language, then we can amplify that both the challenges as well as the progress that's being made.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. It'll have to also be somewhat brief. We have a question from Esther at the International Land Coalition. Esther says, clearly women's land rights are essential for fulfilling women's human rights. How do we turn this expert consensus at the highest levels into action and investment from states and donors to support the work on the ground, particularly to strengthen community-driven data collection that could inform progressive policy? So it's a big question, and we don't have a lot of time to answer it, but anyone want to take a crack at that one?
I can start. I'd say that as an Hanstad practitioner, one of the things that really works for us is when we work together with state actors to try and ensure policies are not only community-centered, but also women-centered, specifically policies that address issues to do with land, because land is our primary economic catalyst. In terms of disseminating our international and regional advocacy up to local level, that is something that is progressive, and there's always room for improvement, but we are getting better at it. And this I can say from the laws that are being passed, you get that they accommodate women more. They appreciate the fact that there's that generational exclusion of women from decision-making spaces, so they try to promote policies that include women. I'd say there's improvement, but there's always room to do better.
Great, thank you. Well, we are running close to the end of our time together, but I wanted to give each panelist an opportunity for a very brief 60 seconds parting observation or piece of advice kind of on this topic and perhaps based on this discussion. So Anne, I want to start with you, please.
Well, thank you. I've always been a big believer in really community-based integrated approaches. And when you look at land rights, it's really got to be looked at, particularly in terms of women. How does it impact the ability to alleviate poverty, which then impacts the ability for the family to move forward, better nutrition, better access to education, better access to healthcare. I mean, all of the issues really do integrate. And I think it's very important as we look at land rights and women's land rights to see how it really impacts all of the other issues that we're dealing with. I would also say we really need to look at issues, not as competing issues, but as complementary issues along the lines of what I was talking about. And also other organizations that are working in these spaces as not competition, but organizations that can complement what we do. One of the other things that has been, I think, not focused on enough, you know, we're all sitting here representing organizations, all of one of which is not based in the areas where we're working. And I think more focus needs to be put on how do we support organizations like that Faith leads? How do we really empower those who are doing the work at the community level on the ground and who are living in those communities, who grew up in those communities? And more, I think we need to put more focus onto that.
Thanks, Anne. And I saw Faith clapping back there. Laura.
Yeah, so I would absolutely second all of Anne's points there, and I think to build particularly on the last one, I think, and potentially going back to Esther's previous question, you know, I think one of the big things here is that there's a lot of success and work going on at a community level that we all can do a better job at raising to the forefront and bringing to policymakers, to decision makers, to donors, including the foundation and others. And so, you know, it's very hard to invest in a problem. It's a lot easier to invest in a solution. Those solutions should be 100% community driven. The extent to which communities feel they have solutions, I think we can do a better job as a development community in bringing some of those solutions to light, so that those are then the things that we invest in the future and scale up in the future. So, you know, this kind of builds on Anne's point there. I think that would be my sort of big message.
Thanks, Laura. Deanna?
Yeah, building on everything that has been said, with which I absolutely agree. I wanted to bring the elephant in the room also here and make sure that even though COVID-19 is a major challenge, we make sure not to get too distracted by that and still realize that women's land rights is the foundation for the world we want to see post-COVID-19. So let's make sure that we don't run away from that, but actually we focus on it as we have been over the years. And thinking of the work that, or the advice that was already shared, how do we complement each other? We have a once in a generation opportunity with the SDGs to really bring this to the forefront. And given the audience in the panel plus the participants, I think we can do a stronger job of unifying our language and simplifying what we're talking about, prioritizing what we want to accomplish. And this means that each of us is going to shift what we're doing a little bit. We're not just adjusting the messaging, we are prioritizing in a coordinated way so that we can actually together make a difference. And I think we can do that.
Thanks, Deanna. And last but not least, Faith.
Thank you very much, team. I'd just like to say that women land rights are human rights for us. They are so basic, and we cannot separate the two. When we get land as African women, as Kenyan women, we will have a very powerful catalyst to our economic empowerment, to a point where we will progressively better our lives, have better livelihoods, have a better access to credit, access justice better, and hence we will at some point be at least closer to our male counterparts who are always having the best lands, always having a say in decision making, always being given priorities in most spaces. So for me, I'd just like to say that land in the hands of women is a powerful economic catalyst for us, which we are ready to do and ready to engage in and ready to transact on if we are supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith, and thank you to all of our panelists, for powerful women who brought just this great discussion, so many great points here. Thank you, Anne, thank you, Laura, thank you, Deanna, thank you, Faith. I also want to thank the organizers. Landesa played a huge role in organizing this, along with the Chandler Foundation, but also Catalyst 2030, who brought all of this together. Again, visit the websites, Catalyst 2030, Kenya Land Alliance, Stand for a Land Campaign, Landesa, and there's other great groups out there working on this super important topic. But thank you for your time today. Have a happy Wednesday, and we're signing off for now. Thank you. Bye.